Hey, what's going on everybody? Today we're going to go over how to set up an Edgerouter 4 for the first time. If you've seen my Edgerouter-X video on the same topic, then these are going to be very similar. These devices use the same GUI and the setup is the same to get it running off the ground. However, there are a couple differences between the Edgerouter 4 and the Edgerouter-X, which I will talk about. But for now, let's just kind of go over just a quick view of what we got here. On the Edgerouter 4, what you don't have on the Edgerouter-X, you got a console port, a USB connection, and then 3 regular Ethernet ports and an SFP port here on the edge. So technically there are 4 ports that you can use on this device, but you will need an SFP for the 4th one. And we've also got a light here for UNMS, or I believe it's called UISP now. That light works very similarly to the UniFi devices, where white means it's not connected to a controller and blue means that it is. It's the same thing on this, except you're not dealing with the UniFi controller, you're dealing with UISP, or previously known as UNMS. Now let's just go ahead and get off the ground here, plug in the router. One of the things I like about it is that it just has a regular power plug on the back. The inverter is built in, so there is no power brick. And it's a little bit hard to see in the picture, but that light is actually blue, and that just means that it's booting up. Now, for first time setup, the same as the Edgerouter-X, you're going to want to plug in to Ethernet 0 and change the IP settings of your computer. So on the computer we're using to configure this, we're going to go to the Network and Settings Center, Ethernet, Change Adapter Options, our Ethernet connection, Properties, IPv4, and we're going to input the following: 192.168.1. Anything other than 1, so I'm just going to use .5. It's going to auto-fill out the subnet mask, and our default gateway is going to be 192.168.1.1, which is the IP address of Ethernet 0 on our Edgerouter 4. Go ahead and close out of those and open a web browser. And you can see we got the notification for the network being active. So let's just go ahead and browse to 192.168.1.1. We will get a security warning. And just go ahead and go past that. And now we are at the login page for our Edgerouter 4. Now the default username and password is UBNT. Go ahead and go in there, and it should prompt us, yep, router is in default configuration. Do you want to start the basic setup wizard? Yes, we do. So if you are familiar with the Edgerouter-X, this is all the exact same setup, but if you are not, we'll go ahead and go through this wizard here. So it's going to ask which port do you want as the internet port. You only have 2 options, Ethernet 0 or the SFP port. We're going to keep that on Ethernet 0. And then we get to select our internet connection type. Now this is going to depend on your ISP. If you have a static IP, you can put that in here. If you're using PPPoE, then you can put in your account name and password here. Most internet connections are going to be DHCP, so we're just going to leave it as that. And we're not going to worry about any of these other checkboxes. We're going to leave the IPv4 and IPv6 firewall checked. That just means it's going to make the default firewall for this internet connection for us. DNS forwarding, we're not going to worry about. Now, one difference here is this bridging option. On the Edgerouter 4 and other models of Edgerouters, such as, I believe, the Edgerouter Lite, and off the top of my head, I can't remember the other models, but there are 2 different hardware versions of the Edgerouter. One of them, like the Edgerouter-X, is called MediaTek-based, and this Edgerouter 4 is Cavium-based. On the Edgerouter-X, you can bridge all the interfaces. It has a switch chip, and you can have all the ports on the same network and not have any performance hit. The Edgerouter 4 is a little bit different. It doesn't have a switch chip built in, so if you do bridge interfaces on the Edgerouter 4, meaning that 2 of the ports are on the same network, you will have a performance hit between those 2 interfaces, because it has to process all of that traffic by the CPU in between those ports. And we're going to go ahead and leave that unchecked. We're not going to bridge any of those. And then our Lan ports, this is where you can set a custom network if you want it to be anything other than 192.168.1.1. We're going to leave it as that, and we're also going to leave the DHCP server checked. Now, the second one, optional, by default, your second port, or Ethernet 2, is going to be configured with the 192.168.2 network. This is just how it comes. You can disable that and I believe blank that out, but we're going to leave it as is for now. And we're going to go ahead and set up the default user. Now I'm just going to go ahead and keep it all the same, so UBNT all across the board. I do recommend changing this. Most of the time I change the user to something specific, like I'll use Netman or something, and then my own password in there, just for security's sake, because if you leave it as UBNT, everybody is going to be able to access it if they have the ability to see the login page. And we're just going to go ahead and click apply. We're going to get this nice warning that says the current configuration will be replaced and a reboot is required. So we're going to go ahead and apply the changes and reboot. Yes, I am sure. So now your router is going to reboot and apply these configurations that we just did using the basic setup wizard. Now at this point, you're going to want to move your connection from Ethernet 0 to Ethernet 1, because we configured now both Ethernet 1 and Ethernet 2 as our LAN ports, and Ethernet 0 is now our WAN port, or internet port. So we're going to go ahead and connect that to our modem or whatever we have for our internet connection. So for the purposes of this video, this gray cord is my internet and this red cord is the PC that we are on. And once that light stops flashing on the front, we should be good to connect back. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and change our IP settings. We don't need that static IP anymore. It will still work because we didn't change that network, but just to make sure DHCP is working, we're going to change this back to obtain everything automatically. And we should pick up an IP address from the router once it has rebooted. And if for some reason that's taken too long, or you want to do it manually, or there was some other problem, just go ahead and open your command prompt and do ipconfig/release and ipconfig/renew. And that should ask the router for a new IP address, and you can see in the bottom right we did change from no internet to internet access. So we should be good now, and we should be able to browse the internet. So let's just go ahead and go to speedtest.net just to verify we can hit it, and we can. So that's really all there is to get this off the ground. It is now functioning as a router for your network, and you have internet access through it. Let's go ahead and log back into the interface and look at a few things. Okay, and you can see our interface configurations here on the dashboard. We have local, which is Ethernet 1, 192.168.1.1, and that is connected. That is what is connected to our PC at this moment. And we have our WAN port, which received an address via DHCP. This would be your public IP if you have just a modem, or in my case it is actually a private IP because I'm going through an existing router, but your configuration will vary a bit on the internet side of things. And if we go to our firewall NAT tab and firewall policies, you will see we have the two default firewalls set up, WAN in and WAN local, both of those for Ethernet 0, our WAN port. And that is what was set up by the basic setup wizard by default, by leaving those IPv4 and IPv6 firewall checkboxes checked. Now, one last thing we need to do, and if you are familiar with the edge routers, you will know that offloading is something that you want to do for performance reasons. And what this does is it offloads some of the processes to the hardware itself, instead of having to put everything through the processor of the unit. And this increases your performance dramatically. I always recommend you doing it. But if you're familiar with the Edgerouter-X, then this is going to be a little bit different. There's actually two different command sets between the Cavium-based and MediaTek-based devices. The Edgerouter 4 being Cavium, there's actually a lot more offloading commands we need to put in. So let's go ahead and log into the command line, which I found in the upper right-hand corner of the UI. Log in using UBNT, and we have a boot image prompt there, which I will get to in just a minute. But let's go ahead and enter configure mode, and we're going to do set system offload And we'll go ahead and do a question mark and see what we got. We got HWNAT, which is the same as the Edgerouter-X. So we're going to go ahead and enable that. And you can see we get this error message that says this platform integrates hardware NAT into forwarding offload, and it's not individually configurable. So if you can't use the command, it's going to give you an error message like this. So while that command would have worked on the Edgerouter-X, it does not work on this Edgerouter 4. And what that error message means is that we need to do offload IPv4 forwarding enable, and NAT is built into this command. Now, in addition to this IPv4 forwarding, we're also going to do IPv4 VLAN enable, as well as all of these other ones, and just see which ones don't work. So GRE enable, PPPoE enable, and we're not going to worry about table size, but we are going to do the same thing for IPv6. So IPv6 forwarding enable, VLAN enable, PPPoE enable. And you can see we get an error message for IPv6 PPPoE, and that is that VLAN must be disabled for PPPoE offload. That's fine. Well, we don't need PPPoE anyway, so we're not going to worry about that. Now we're going to see which one of these we missed. Okay, IPsec enable. So set system offload IPsec enable, and that should be all of our offloading commands. Now, where the Edgerouter-X we only needed 2 of these commands, on this one we needed all of those to enable all of the offloading features. And there will be a link in the description below for all of these commands on UBNT's website. But for now, we're going to go ahead and commit that. And we're going to get this error saying that the configuration has changed. We need to refresh the UI. Anytime you make a change in the command line, it's going to tell you that a change was made in the GUI and to refresh, because it doesn't want those two things to conflict. Because while you're looking at the graphical interface, it's not going to update in real time with changes made by the command line, and vice versa. And we get an error message, unable to load configuration. Just go ahead and do another refresh, and that looks to have gone away. Now let's go ahead and go back into the command line, UBNT, and we'll go ahead and do a enter configure mode, and then save. And now while we're in configure mode, if we do want to try those commands again, so set system offload IPv4 forwarding enable, we should get an error message that says the specified configuration node already exists. That means that that's already configured. We don't need to put it in again. So let's go ahead and exit out of configuration mode and just go ahead and exit out of the command line in general. Now, one thing I will just kind of point out in this video, which is kind of beyond the scope of just setting this up, if you are looking to configure VLANs and you're familiar with the Edgerouter-X, that is one difference on the Cavium-based devices. You can see that there is no switch 0 interface, so there is no interface to actually assign VLANs and VIFs and all that, and that is because the switch chip doesn't exist on these routers. So for VLANs, the concepts and everything are all the same, but actually configuring them is a little bit different. So you can add a VLAN and you assign it to an interface. So basically, instead of configuring switch 0 with VLANs, you're going to put the VLANs on the interface itself. So if we wanted to do a VLAN, we could attach it to Ethernet 1, give it the ID of our VLAN number, and then just go ahead and add that. And you can see that we created eth1.10, where on the Edgerouter that would be switch 0.10. So if you're familiar with routers, this is a full-blown router, and you're using virtual interfaces under these ports instead of on a switch chip. And like I said, that's beyond the scope of this video. That's if you want to do VLANs and you're familiar with them. That's just a little tidbit of information for you. Now at this point we will go into the console port, which is one of the features of the Edgerouter 4 and other edge routers that the lower ends don't have. I actually really like console ports. It's a direct access to the command line itself. Basically, on the console port, if you plug into that, you can use a terminal emulator to pull up the command line. You cannot get the graphical interface through this port, you cannot connect to it like Ethernet. It is a serial console. And if you're unfamiliar with serial console ports, you need what's called a rollover cable, which is included with just about every Cisco device ever. If you're familiar with Cisco devices, you will know about these cables. They're everywhere when it comes to Cisco, and these are your serial cables. So this end would connect to your PC, and then this end would go into the console port. We're going to go ahead and connect that up. Now, most PCs nowadays do not have a serial port on the back of them. So what you would need is a USB to serial adapter, which I have here. We're going to go ahead and plug that up and plug it into our computer. And in order to use this, we're going to download something called PuTTY. So just Google download PuTTY. Go to the download. And we're going to go ahead and get the 64-bit alternative. Go ahead and open that. And what we should be able to do is switch that to serial. The speed for the Edgerouter 4 is going to be 115200. You might be able to leave that as 9600, but according to Ubiquiti, this is the speed it uses. Now, your serial line, you've got to determine which COM port your adapter is on. So we're going to go ahead and go to Device Manager, and we're going to look for this ports, COM, and LPT. And you can see we have prolific USB to serial COM port, COM3. So that is the number that we're going to want to put in here. And we just click open and then hit enter a couple times. And you can see we have our command line. And we can log in with UBNT, or whatever you set your password to, and do our configuration through here. Now, this is just kind of a little bit of extra information on how to use the console port. I personally really like them. I like it when devices have this because it's kind of a fail-safe, where if you're unable to hit the GUI, or you mess up the IP addresses, you mess up the VLANs, you just straight up mess up your configuration where you're locked out from web management, you always have this console port that you can fall back to and get into the command line, fix what you need to fix, without having to completely reset the device. And speaking of resetting the device, there is a reset button here on the very right hand side of the device. If you use a paperclip or something, you can hold that down. Now, I have the same things I've said about the reset button on these apply here. However, I know that I have explained it a little bit weird in the past. So if you do use the reset button, it's going to reset the device to factory default. So everything we've done in this video so far will be reverted. Ethernet 0 will be your management port again with 192.168.1.1 as the IP address, and you'll have to go through the basic setup wizard again, or upload a backup configuration if you have one around. So just as I've said before, these devices do not technically function for an internet connection out of the box. You do have to go through that basic setup wizard. So if you do hold down the reset button, just know that you will have to go through the configuration again or restore from a backup. And that is pretty much it. I didn't go over the USB port on the front just because I personally haven't used it yet. You can connect it up there. You can't boot from the USB, so if you're trying to use some kind of other operating system from the USB, don't really think that you're going to use it as a boot device. Really, it's just kind of for firmware files. One good reason I can think of to use the USB port is plug in a flash drive with the firmware on it to connect to the console port and do a firmware upgrade that way, in case you're locked out or the device doesn't have internet access, or whatever reason you need to use the console to upgrade the firmware or something, or load a file. Then you can connect a flash drive to it. It'll show up as a device and you can move files from there. But anyways, if you have any questions, just leave them in the comments below. Hopefully this answers most of your questions, but it is very similar to the Edgerouter-X setup since they all run the same operating system. There's just a couple differences in the actual hardware and how certain things will be configured. But hopefully this went over everything you need to get off the ground, so happy networking.